Welcome back to another night of Political Soul for everybody. I'm ready to get down once again. It's Wednesday, April the 3rd, 2019. We're in the 21st century, and we got 21st century problems. But a lot of 21st century problems have their roots in a deep, dark past. And so the problems that we got to deal with have a history. So we want to make sure we understand that history, and that means the ideas that we are wrestling with have histories, and we want to check them out. So today what I wanted to do was talk about a debate I was in on Facebook, and I think it's still ongoing, and the person or the people I'm debating with about racism and capitalism and imperialism, they haven't responded yet. Maybe they're not going to respond, but I'm willing to spar on this topic as long as it takes. So you know what? Let's just go straight through. I see my boy GD Stokes up in the house on IG, and we got Wayman up here on Facebook. I want to holler at y'all and say what's up. Just in case I forget, we got a nice show coming up tomorrow. I'm going to interview an actress and playwright who is producing a play here in New York City. Nan Lynn Nelson, check her out. I put up some info on the story, so if you're in New York, make sure you check that out because you might be able to win a ticket. And if you're not in New York, you might want to win a ticket for someone you know who lives in New York. That'd be a nice gift. So check out the info. The name of the play is called Glory, and it's going to be dope. The system I'm talking to, she's real deep. She's for the cause. She's talented, creative, beautiful, black, and she has a drive. And she's doing some great things for the community and in the world of the arts and theater and entertainment at large. So look out for that tomorrow. We're going to hit up at 8:30. We're going to be in a different spot. It should be real cool. So I invite you all to chime in and partake in some good political soul food discussion. So let's move on. I just want to chat a little bit. I'm not gonna hold y'all too long tonight in the podcast. So I was in a debate, and so again, I'm in this group that I told y'all to check out on Facebook. It's called Black Studies and Critical Thinking. So if you're on Facebook, check out that group, become a member. You're gonna meet a lot of people from different black political perspectives, and so it's a great community to be a part of. You realize that we're not alone. There are other people around the world who are stressed out and who can provide helpful ways to take on the political problems we're dealing with, and you can make a lot of connections. And it's nothing like being a part of a community. That's one of the biggest needs for an individual human being living in a community. And it's psycho and somatic, man. And so it's definitely a good vibe all the way around. Although, I mean, there are some groups or there are certain perspectives that I don't agree with, and some I'm very suspicious of. Sometimes I wonder if some of the people who are in these groups are like undercover agents trying to like divide and inject pessimism into the black political group. Those who are active, I think, are probably targeted so that way we lose faith, and more importantly than faith, that we lose our responsibility to partake in voting and other forms of political change. So somebody put up a post. Let me just jump into this. Somebody put up a post. I guess I should read the post. It says, the media has done a disservice painting socialism as a white idea and desire. Nothing can be further from the truth. The black radical tradition should always be honored. Who are your favorite black socialists? So it's a article. So somebody had wrote that to an article from truthout.org, and the headline of that article is Socialist Principles Have Always Been Part of Black American Tradition. Black American socialism is rooted in long-standing traditions of mutual aid. So, all right, so that's not, a big problem. So the problem came when, so I had made a comment. So people were talking about, what's the fundamental problem of our day. And so people were talking about slavery and Jim Crow and socialism, this and the third. So I had came in, I'm not going to read everything that happened here. So basically what was going on before I got in, people were sort of pitting, racism against capitalism, and they were saying, and so the author of this post ended up saying that, capitalism is the main problem, racism is not an issue, and so I had chimed in, and here's what I said. I said, and let me know what you think. This is right now like a two-way street for real. So I said, racism is the problem, not capitalism. White America rejects a fair, equitable society, capitalist or socialist, because it rejects diversity. And so the authors of this page don't take too kindly to that kind of approach, because they're fundamentally focused on capitalism. And so the whole idea is that if they're able to throw all of the capitalists, all of the CEOs of big banks in jail, then America will suddenly be a great place. Like that's the only thing we should focus on. That's the only thing we should focus on. So to make the case here, so here's what happened. So the author of the post responded to me and said, racism is not the problem, capitalism is. And then they said to me, we reject it too, actually. How many of us are fighting for socialism today? And so I kind of hit back. So it was a little petty in the beginning. And then it starts to build up, and the arguments start to be flushed out a little bit. So I responded, racism is a problem. And I'm sure the majority of black people know this. And he goes, black folks may think it is because we have been conditioned to look no further than an idea between a person's head. Racism is the least of our problems. Capitalism is what we suffer from, but you will never hear that on CNN, MSNBC, so we are unaware of that. Our ancestors understood this, though. And then he goes, all right, so then he typed that twice by accident. So I'm like, well, listen, I said, so for the record, you see slavery as the least of black people's problems. Good to know where you stand. I had made a mistake. I meant to type in racism. So he said, slavery, are you under slavery or capitalism? Was slavery capitalism? So I fixed my comment and basically said, and I'm just reading everything so that no one can say I skipped anything. So then I corrected the word slavery. I meant to say racism because that's what we've been talking about for this since I commented, and my comment was about racism. So then I just fixed it and I just said, so for the record, you see racism as the least of black people's problems. Good to know where you stand. Right? And so let me just stop here. I consistently come here and talk about the importance of understanding racism. And one of the reasons why I do this is I'm not talking to people who don't care about racism. I'm not talking to white people who are pushing white nationalism. I'm actually trying to remind people on the left, like liberals and in fact, black people. So I'm having a debate with what I'm going to take on faith a person of color. Some other people joining the conversation. This person has a reputation of saying some things that people think that he's like maybe some insurgent, but leave that alone. I don't want to taint your opinion. Let's discuss this concept right here. So I'm talking to a brother who is saying that black people have been conditioned to think that racism is our problem. And this is a very influential voice on this platform. And maybe you feel that way. I don't know. Chime in and let me know. But this is where, this is where it begins for me and where it ends in a sense. It begins in terms of me wanting to respond, and it ends where if there were any common ground shared, I'm separating, my position from anyone who says that black people have been conditioned to think racism is a problem. Now, the whole idea is, it probably right now where we are doesn't make much sense to like not move forward just because we see one or the other as being more fundamental. I mean, there's still work to be done. I understand the transgressions of capitalism, or at least as it is played out here in the United States, because there's something to be said about that, which I'll mention later. One of the main issues is that, before I get back to this debate I'm in, is that too often people with divergent sort of fundamental conceptualizations of a problem don't work together, particularly when they are trying to address the same problem and when they're both suffering because of two problems that, because they're so powerful, they're almost acting as one. So capitalism is a huge force in America, right? And the exploitation of the economic system is huge. I mean, it is the cause of a lot of poverty. But again, I'll make my case a little later. A lot of that has to do with racism. So anyway, but I just want to say this, for many of us, I think that because we're suffering from all of those issues one way or another, that it is not worth expending too much energy, coming after each other and not finding common ground. So, I do keep that in mind. But it becomes a problem when, someone will say, well, if you don't agree that capitalism is the most fundamental problem, then you're a traitor. Or you start saying that, black people have been brainwashed to think that racism is a problem presently, when we're seeing racism at work. Like, I mean, we're seeing right now, throughout Obama's presidency, even now, people are boldly claiming, their heritage to a white American society, treasuring, Confederates who were treasonous, who killed Americans because they wanted to make sure they can keep their hold on other people, to maintain slaves. All right, now this is the reality that has produced racism and has maintained it in various forms since the Civil War. So this is no illusion. Black people are not brainwashed. And then this is where it gets really crazy for me. And then it's going to be impossible to find common ground. And in fact, this is what makes me very suspicious. That line of argument, I mean, to go so far to say people are brainwashed over a topic of racism, it reeks of some sort of slick, insidious conservative conspiracy that makes me like not really think that this person is arguing honestly and really mean to say that they're looking to create a better society apart from conservatism. I can't buy it when that's that old sort of the cultural decadence. That's the cultural argument that conservatives tend to use. Oh, it's the culture. That's why black people don't do better, or any group that doesn't do better, because the challenges that they're claiming to stop them have evaporated. But that's not true, because the problems are ingrained in the fabric of the American institutions, which disproportionately favors certain groups over others, right? Under the radar, without a person having to call another the N-word or do anything crazy, pull out the dogs and something, really, really violent, explicit violence. Although we are seeing the explicit violence happening nowadays too, albeit not in the same fashion and as intense in the past, but the systemic racism in institutions is still very much carrying the torch. All right, so let me move on a little bit. I got a comment here. Let's see. There's this false sense of reality for some people of color where they think that because people of color has made many great strides in society until they think that racism is at an all-time low or does not exist. And if someone of color cry out racism, they are playing the race card. Absolutely. I absolutely. And yo, bro, I would say this. I don't even know if that explanation would fit this dude. I mean, that in fact would be very much more understandable. Someone maybe misreading the progress. And this person doesn't seem to acknowledge that at all, to the point where while they're seemingly arguing on behalf of black people, along the way, they really put black people down. Dr. Marshall asks, can you share this person's generation? I'm not sure. From what I can depict, this person seems to be somewhere in the 40s and 50s. I could be totally wrong. But from what I can see and have seen in the past, I haven't really investigated this person, and really didn't stalk their page that much. But from the conversations and what I've been hearing, and from the glances from that person's page that when I did see, I'm getting the idea of 40s and 40s at least. And that's if this person is really the person on the Facebook page. So let me continue. So here's my response. So I said, let me leave out the name. Well, the majority of black people understand and acknowledge racism as the number one problem. Oh, so before I go there, so did I tell you? So yeah, so he says, yes, I see racism as the very least of our problems. And then he goes on to say, yes, I see lack of health care, environment, poor wages, poor jobs, on and on and on, and many, many, many capitalist-related things as our issues. I don't see a philosophy that resides between an individual's head as our biggest threat. I see capitalism as our biggest threat. This is in line with the black radical tradition. So there's a number of issues with that. So here's my response. I said, well, first, the majority of black people understand and acknowledge racism as the number one problem. And I said lack of, quote, healthcare, environment, poor wages, poor jobs, and so on, end quote, are the result of racism. And then I went on to add the black radical tradition and all others see slavery/racism as a number one problem, but they choose different remedies. And so let me hash out what I mean by that. Basically, well, one, first of all, I mean, polls have been done, and I don't really need to do a poll, but let me just hold myself accountable. Polls show that black people see racism as the key major problem in American society, whereas whites don't, on average. Okay, so that's that. And I guess we would be bamboozled, or we've been conditioned to think that. But, I mean, and even if that were the case, you have scholars who are actually working out some of the roots of the inequalities in our system, even inequalities that white people are facing, and that's traced back to racism. All right, and so where does capitalism come in as a problem, one might ask? We'll get to that in a second, but let me just show in what case, in what ways, healthcare, environment, poor wages, poor jobs are the result of racism. Well, many of these kind of social programs have been embraced. Healthcare has been embraced, having a clean environment. Even Nixon was one of the first major presidents to make big pushes for the environment. Not necessarily because he was really wanting to, but I mean, the issue though is that you have presidents who were around when racism was at its height, more so than today, right? Actually pushing for these kinds of agendas: healthcare, environment, poor wages, and poor jobs. In fact, we see a decline in employment. We see a decline in the health of Americans, at least having access to healthcare, reasonably, in terms of being able to pay it, we see a decline in that, and we have to ask ourselves, why is there a decline? Why is there an increase in the the wealth gap? Why is there middle class shrinking when it was white America fighting for these things? They're not categorically opposed to it. They don't really look at it as evil in a way many may seem to say it, but it's because they don't want to share the American prosperity, and more importantly, American identity, which comes along with such privileges, with other people. And that's the connection. That is the connection. The New Deal, like I said, in short, check out a very important book, When Affirmative Action Was White. It's a very important book. It goes into the molecular details of how and why racism is a number one issue, and that capitalism is, in many ways, a tentacle of racism and patriarchy and hereditary inequality. Those ideologies working together. Not to say that it doesn't have its sort of divergent agendas, and not to say that these multiple heads of this demon of inequality and oppression does not to say that they don't sort of bicker and butt heads. However, when you talk about these specific issues in this country, they can all be traced back to racism. All right, in terms of the Black radical tradition, I would recommend a very important book, Black Visions by Michael C. Dawson, an amazing political scientist, political theorist, and one of the leading theorists and scholars on the Black political tradition. This text here on Instagram is going to look backwards, but it's called Black Visions, and the subtitle says it all: The Roots of Contemporary African American Political Ideologies. The roots of contemporary African American political ideologies. And what's interesting with this book is that it lets us know, like, hey, the jump off for Black political ideologies is the aftermath of slavery. Okay, so off the bat, Black ideologies are responding to the political, social, economic oppressions and inequalities in this society. And those inequalities, these issues, stem from racism. So all ideologies, all traditions ultimately see racism as a major issue. Now, you do have some sects in the Black political tradition who hold a very strong Marxist view and may interpret racism as sort of an offshoot or branch of sort of this materialist society or agendas, and seeing racism as being a way of exploiting people for material gain. However, fundamentally, these even black Marxists have to contend with the fact that, first, there have been Marxists who are very racist, and that racism has had a sort of exacerbated the effects of capitalism in a way that, one, you can have a conversation about how capitalism impact Black communities, African communities versus European communities, where in a way that European communities as a whole, the groups of people as a whole, are benefiting more. So you can have these two separate, you can actually dissect the effects of capitalism when it's mixed with racism, which I think brings the question, so what is racism doing to make capitalism that bad? And why is it that racism can actually stand on its own regardless of a pure capitalist regime, or even a socialist regime? And what I mean is, when I bring attention to FDR, who tends to be ironically, so the person here who is touting the Black radical tradition also touts FDR. And FDR, when he pushed the New Deal, permitted the southern states to distribute the resources from the from the New Deal and along racial lines. And we talked a little bit about that. So that's strange. So in other words, the champion of socialism and liberalism for this individual actually was a proponent of racism. So the socialist policy in and of itself doesn't necessarily correct the treatment of people based on color, because you have to solve the problem: who is a citizen in this country, who is entitled to those political privileges, said like that. Okay, socialism does not address that. Now, I'm not speaking negatively about socialism. Ultimately, I'm not saying no to socialism, yes to capitalism. I'm not doing any of that right now. I am saying that my main argument is that racism is a fundamental problem. Our boy Du Bois, if we want to talk about the Black radical tradition, and Du Bois is a part of that, one of the earlier ones, right, who also championed socialism, but he said the problem of the 20th century is the color line. The color line. So that's another thing I could have thrown at him. So moving on, so he goes on to say, I told you why the majority of black people think in terms of identity politics. Now here's the first thing that's really crazy. Rather than policy, right? It's a form of brainwashing. The things I mentioned are a result of capitalism and has nothing at all to do with racism directly. The black radical tradition did not see racism as the number one problem. It was a symptom. Okay, so I would concede that there's a small sect of the black radical tradition that would make that kind of argument. Herbert Apather would be one, and others. But and even Langston Hughes, for example, took on sort of a Marxist kind of view, but he kind of said, nah, he left. And Ralph Ellison's another one who sort of said, well, you know what, they didn't really see that as a fundamental problem. So, I mean, I think his reading is still, there are a few who are making this argument now, but historically, there's been a lot of shifts, because what's been happening regardless, and I have to say too, we're both, for myself, I'm mainly speaking about the black political traditions on the left. And even the black political traditions on the right, the conservative blacks also see racism as a fundamental problem there. So I'm still saved by the bell on that end, but they just have a different choices for resolution, right? Get with the program, get with the capitalism, or whatever like that. But they do see a problem. All right, so what I want to mention here now is, all right, so notice that this brainwashing keeps coming up. He keeps saying that we are brainwashed. That's very suspicious for me. Like the majority of blacks are brainwashed. Okay. All right. So the next thing here is, so I said, sir, black people are not brainwashed. What you mentioned are mostly a result of racism and systemic hereditary inequality. And so there's something here. Identity politics. This is something that we all got to get now. You're going to hear this a lot, that Democrats use identity politics. And what's funny? Even people on the left complain about identity politics. And when they're saying that, they're really saying black people need to just like rein it in and, get with the economic program. So black people are, and minorities are being attacked in this way, to like zip it up about racism, right? They'd rather have a great big debate about economics and everything else, but leave the racism out. We can talk about anything, we can yell about anything, but leave racism, slavery, leave that out. And you see that on the left, in the far left, even those coming, from out of Bernie's camp, and less so Elizabeth Warren. She's kind of come around a lot. But, many on the far left and also on the right. Racism is like this thing we can't talk about, right? And I wonder why. What's common ground? Mostly, I'll just put it bluntly, most people who tend to say that are white, and racism is not like their major problem for them. It is truly only economic for them, and they're not really concerned with how, in the way that racism plagues, generations and generations of people, and prevent access, equal access to all of the political amenities that should be available to American citizens. But that's not their problem, so they don't see that world, and so what they want to do is advance their agendas. Those on the left, I get it, but that is a form of a privilege, a certain kind of white privilege, to be able to say, listen, let's just get with the program and put your problem to the side, and just try to get a little bit more money in our pocket. And even making a little bit more money in our pocket does not address the psychological and cultural abuses, which also translates to economic well-being and or our physical well-being. And I can digress into that on and on and on. So that's something to keep in mind. But identity politics, first of all, the left did not create identity politics, and certainly not the black people. Black people didn't do it. Remember the episode I did on the first the first act that addressed immigration and naturalization of 1790, and I read an excerpt that basically delineated who can become an American citizen, and it started off what you have to be white. You have to be white. That was the initial, political, piece of legislation addressing naturalization and immigration. That is when identity politics was established, at least in that track. I mean, established long before, but 1790. This was 1 year after the signing of the United States Constitution in 1789. So identity politics was created by the racist people who are basically saying to become a citizen, you have to be white. That's identity. In order to be a political entity, which means you are protected by the rights outlined in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights fully, you need to be white. That's in the first piece of legislation dealing with naturalization and immigration. In a sense, the first Immigration Act was in and of itself an agenda for identity politics. So when people come say, got to put this identity politics behind, they're doing nothing more than advocating that kind of white supremacist language. Okay? So that's something to keep in mind. So it's in the history books. When you read all of these early policies and laws, white is written in. It's written in. White is written in. And Negroes and slaves are written in. Explicitly. You look at some of the writings of the states, they're saying, Negroes and other slaves are barbaric and we have to do this. You look at the Virginia slave codes of 1660, it's written in when they're trying to keep whites and blacks from working together. All right. So obviously I couldn't say all this in this debate here I had, but I'm standing out here with y'all. I'm sort of exhaling. So the next thing, so somebody else jumps in on me. It was like a little tag team. So I was kind of jumped by like 3 people. And so this next person says, you can't have a fair and equitable capitalist society. They're contradictory. And there is no history of racism outside the history of capitalism. So this was an interesting one. And then he also said, and I'll address everything later, black people had to be biologically and inherently inferior to justify their economic exploitation. Ever notice how all the racist tropes seem to lend themselves to this idea that black people are well suited for forced labor? Okay, so there's some interesting points here. There's some good points made here. So my response, I had to keep my response short because I was like moving, I was typing. Some people can zoom with the 2 fingers. I really can't. And, I had to get to work to teach and stuff today. So here's I'll read what I wrote and then I'll like sort of hash out here for us. So I said, America has yet to have any real capitalist society. Second, the history of slavery and racism has existed before the history of capitalism. And then I also said, responding to the other part, tropes about inherent inferiority among humans in labor predates capitalism. All right, so I should hash that out. So because it sounds like I'm trying to support capitalism. I'm just making it clear that by even by the standards of capitalism, or at least let's say the founding fathers of capitalism, America has yet to fulfill those standards. And so again, I'm delineating, I'm sort of clarifying sort of a history of an idea. So he goes, no, the history of racism doesn't predate capitalism. Racism isn't simply the belief there are inherently inferior humans. So the issue is that, and then I'll add his other comment, and unlike other systems of slavery, the transatlantic slave trade was bolstered by the systemic belief that this entire race of people was genetically suited for bondage. He says a lot here, so I'll read a little bit more just to do right. America is probably the most rapacious capitalist society on the planet. You seem to be trying a no true Scotsman argument here to say it's not really capitalist. Other institutions of slavery did not have this racial biological component. You became a slave to pay off a debt, or as a punishment for you were a prisoner of war. From what I looked at, the idea that you could be born into a system of bondage with no way out because of your racial stock, where we also breed people like livestock, was unique to Western liberal democracies. Okay, so here's my response in short to that. There were some really good points in that I agree with to a certain extent. So I said, sir, it's a different person. The concept of racism predates the term racism in capitalism. So number one, the issue is that ideas in the terms we use for these ideas can be parsed. Right? The concept of democracy has been around, but how we understand it kind of changes, it evolves. And there are ideas like secularization that have been going on before we've arrived at a word for that idea, that process, looking back and saying, oh, we can examine certain activities happen, certain processes, certain events. And this is like how we give names to wars, or a group of wars, or an era of a particular civilization. And we look back and say, now, knowing what we know now, being in our position of hindsight, we can give a name to this. And so what's happening here is that he's seeing racism in the way that it exists in modernity. And saying that the idea of racism itself has been born, not realizing that there's a history of this kind of otherizing people based on their ethnicity or their nationality and deeming them inferior as such. And many ancient societies, ancient empires and stuff like that I have here, this book and others can spell some of these things out. Right. And so that was sort of a historical mistake. And I mean, I would like to say, it's a mistake born out of hopefully good intentions. But I am very suspicious because of the derogatory, claims made about black people and people of color while we make these arguments. It's kind of like, the love is not there in a sense. So anyway, so that's the first thing. So racism, slavery and racism predates capitalism. And I mentioned that I said the Atlantic slave trade was bolstered predominantly by technology. All right, so right around the 1700s, particularly in America, for example, when was it? 1793. So Eli Whitney, if I'm correct, comes up with the cotton gin. So, having, slaves wasn't really something that was kind of prosperous. So technology allowed that to work. Had the technology not existed, had the cotton gin not been invented, we still had the issue of racism. We still had the issue of otherizing people, right? And so when you otherize people, you use it as a reason to exploit them, okay? One way or another, in a capitalist society or not. You can be in a feudal society and still exploit people based on whatever reason. If you have that sentiment or attitude towards another person, that can exist apart from any other system, unrelated system. So capitalism is not necessary for racism to exist. And in fact, racism has other roots than capitalism. Racism has been used as an excuse, some of the explanations of racism, and we'll get into that later. But so, I mean, obviously I couldn't say all that. I was like running and going on. So again, so my 2 points is that one, racism predates capitalism. And the way I mean it is that, fine, I'm not talking about American racism. And I understand that the whole idea of, chattel slavery is very unique to this stage of the game because of the added, component of capitalism. But the idea of slavery and the idea of condemning people and belittling people and holding people down because of their ethnicity in general or their national allegiance or culture is not unique. All right. And so we have an admixture of something. So the roots and seeds of racism were already planted before capitalism became, a thing. And what that means is a whole nother story. So, and then I clarify that I'm not making an argument for or against capitalism at this point. I'm just clarifying the history of some idea. So then somebody else comes in. Let me see. We got some points up in here. Let's see here. So Brother James says, identity politics. You explain that socialism does not solve racism. Western liberal society, that's loaded. Yeah, it is a loaded term, right? The people who do not want to acknowledge the truth about slavery will always say it was about capitalism instead of racial superiority. That's G.D. Stokes. G.D. Stokes, for sure. For sure. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. And you know what? Again, like, when Wayman was chiming in on this, I actually hope that it's something that simple that, people who are not acknowledging it, just saying, oh, it's capitalism, right? Like, I hope they're really, really trying to find a solution. But it's hard, right? Because these are the people I'm talking to right now, like every other second, just saying something really negative about black people, in this conversation, already black people have been called, brainwashed. And in other words, like we are dumb and we don't see the truth. And that smells like, some Candace Owens subtle maneuvering, where it's like, get off the plantation, right? And using a sort of complicated feature of history. And again, let me just say, I need to say this because people will hear one thing. I'm not trying to say Democratic Party is like the best party, is going to like change, it's going to like save the world and all that stuff. And there are no people, no races a part of the, the party, and there's no corruption going on. I'm not going that far, right? All right, but I am saying that these major generalizations and claims made, right, are very misleading, and they're used to peel people away from a party that is actually doing very much more than, let's say, the Republican Party. And so I'm very suspicious. Like, people go so far left in a sense in an argument, and the tone is so negative against minorities that they're like going full circle and they end up like back on the side of the right, so I'm very suspicious of the rhetoric in that. So finally, somebody else chimed in, and this gets a little kind of petty for a quick second. Somebody else chimed in, so they're all like in the same camp. They said capitalism needs racism to survive. If you don't understand white supremacy, everything else will be confusing to you. So this is kind of confusing to me. So first of all, right, capitalism can exploit racism, but doesn't need racism. Okay, it needs power, right? And it needs an advantage of, like, let's say, technology. It needs that, right? But again, more than even before that, it just needs material, because think about it. People have, along with the race issue and the slave issue, people have bought into capitalism among themselves. There's a Max Weber, who a sociologist and philosopher and everything. He's a brilliant guy, social theorist, and he wrote a very important essay that is called capitalism, the spirit of capitalism and a Protestant work ethic. Or could it be backwards? I mean, I'll just check, right? So I have it and I read it. It's really, really good. And it shows the marriage of Christianity, religion, and capitalism. And we get this gospel of prosperity here in America that happens in the early 20th century. And then we can see it even before then when the Puritans came over, particularly in Massachusetts. And the settlers there believed that if they did good in the eyes of God, you will prosper. That God will bless those who work hard and live by, his word. Which was an issue with that too, because like many of them were sort of like, well, more were like Lutherans, but many were like Calvinists too, that believe that you're not going to really know, so your destiny is predetermined. But so there's different takes, but the whole idea is that these capitalism has all the ingredients it needs as a self-contained ideology and system, right? So it didn't need racism. Racism helped. In fact, to really get it going, it wasn't racism at the end of the day. It was having the means to exploit people more, right? Regardless of the racism. The racism was going to happen no matter what. Okay. So that was so I said to her, so I said, absolutely not. I said, then I kind of they were kind of saying some little snide comments. So I said a little snide one. Sometimes I drop the critical thinking bull. Once in a while, it's like, fight fire with fire, they say. So I said, that doesn't make sense given that capitalism is predicated on ownership, property, and profit. So my point is that, there are other structural ingredients, right, features of the capitalist society. Now, racism plays, a part in that, in the way that, well, we already have, an attitude towards a group of people, and hey, why not, exploit them? And that's sort of inherent in sort of the games that people play. That's the kind of war game people play. We will conquer you and then we exploit you. I mean, there are some passages in the Bible that says, you conquer a person, you conquer a group, and you take the wives, you take the women, the young women, the virgins, and you do what you got to do. You kill off everybody else, right? So these are unfortunately very cruel rules of engagement, inhumane, that have been around. So a lot of these features have their roots prior to capitalism. I guess that's what I'm saying, right? We can go back, centuries and centuries and centuries. And what we're seeing every day in life, sort of a convergence of ideas and traditions and ways of exploitation, right? So we've seen that. So that's what I mean. And then I go, racism is a deeper issue that preceded capitalism, especially in the way that racism can exist in a socialist society just the same. Racism can exist in a socialist society just the same. We can see it in many of the Eastern European countries. And so we're running out of time right now. I don't want to keep y'all, it's kind of late already. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. So then here's where it kind of fell apart. This new person said, sure, imperialism is about democracy. Sorry about that, got paused. Imperialism is about democracy and freedom, right? And so I guess you're probably assuming that I was like, I don't know, arguing for capitalism. And I said, what are you talking about? I said, what are you talking about now? You jump to a random remark. And then she says, does capitalism not beget imperialism? Capitalism is a big Ponzi scheme, and imperialism is the next step in the pyramid. And I said, imperialism predates capitalism. Marx would tell you that, since they're drawing from Marx, right? One of the things about Marx is that he saw the problems before capitalism. For him, capitalism is just one of many kinds structures of inequality. And in fact, he praised capitalism in the way, not that he wants it, but he praised it in a way that it was necessary to overtake an older system, an older economic system, an older ideological system, feudalism, particularly. So yeah. So anyway, so So then I say, then she says, duh, ain't nothing but colonization. And so I said, so you made my point. She goes, no, you made mine. Capitalism, colonization, imperialism. They only racism to survive. And I said, again, imperialism predates capitalism. The concept of imperialism is derived from empires. I recommend the following texts. So I took a picture of these books, which I'm showing you all here. There's some other books I get. I mean, these are like texts for like academic, classroom settings, but they're really good. I mean, these are very, very well researched texts here. I recommend this one and another one, which is really good. It's just a well researched book, and it's not being ideological. It's just laying down the facts that we have so far. So it's not trying to get you to vote one way or another. It's not trying to argue against Marx or liberalism. It's just noting that there have been empires throughout history, and that empires have been expanding, and empires have different characteristics, different empires, and that the whole idea of imperialism, even though the word was used much later on in the 1800s, around 1826 or something like that, doesn't mean that the concept and that sort of that approach to civilization was not already in effect. Okay, so anyway, I rest my case on that. I'll just kind of divulge my life a little bit. This is what I do once in a while. I haven't really gotten into a debate like this in a while, but I wanted to bring it up because it can better expose where I'm coming from. You hear me, you hear where I'm standing, what position I'm standing on, and where I'm arguing on behalf of. And hopefully some of these things can be insightful, or there are things you can mention to me that will sharpen, my thinking, critical thinking tools. And so, again, I hold that, in summary, racism, like Du Bois, the color line, is the major problem. Do I see capitalism as a huge problem? Well, that's more complicated for me, but I do see the pursuit of hereditary inequality as a main problem. And I do see that as being a tool of racism. If I want to use another word that runs, that people in the academia use, the otherizing, the othering of people. And I think that is a major problem, because at the end of the day, capitalism, the horrible effects and even the successes are based on, who you are ethnically. Now, obviously, it's going awry in many ways, but here's my point. A lot of people are okay with this. And that's the issue. Not that it's not a problem, but the fact that for many people it isn't a problem for them. And my concern is, why isn't it a problem? And that's because of their racial attitude. So for me, that underlying issue is the problem. So when people go, the bankers, yeah, but throwing them all in jail don't change the fact that you have a group of people voting for the politicians who are aiding and abetting, exploitative economic agendas. We have an issue here. We have a white issue here. My homegirl, Professor Carol Anderson, is her book up here? Or did I take it down? White Rage is a great book. I recommend White Rage, and also I recommend, what was the book I recommended earlier? It was White Rage. Oh, and When Affirmative Action Was White. And I recommend these two books for, people of color, minorities, to understand that, if you ask me, America wouldn't mind being more socialist. White America really, really wouldn't mind. That's not the problem for them. And many wouldn't mind a capitalist society if perhaps capitalism was played by the rules that it says, right? That the notion of property stems from the individual right, that an individual is his own person. It's her own person. All right. And when you exploit, when you go against that grain, it is no longer capitalism. You're no longer dealing with the principles that you're starting with. All right. So that's one thing. If we really want to get very, very specific about it. All right. So Dr. Marshall got some points here. Let's see. Dr. Marshall says, was a debate conversation in one of the intellectual academic groups on FB? Yes, it was. It's in the Black Studies Critical Thinking group, Dr. Marshall. You should join. It'd be nice to have your voice in there. I don't think most black people would discuss racism in the context of the debates you were having. I'm not saying blacks can't have this kind of discussion. Much of what you read is what I see as an academic debate. If this kind of information was given in schools, then there are many more. All right, so I mean that's a great way of seeing it. I mean, like, let's say the person I'm speaking with is like, well, no, actually, this person, from what I'm hearing, the rumors that he's a medical doctor, so he has an education, but perhaps not in in the disciplines that I guess are relevant here, Dr. Marshall. But I joke around when I say black people we all should have at least like a bachelor's or master's degree in black history, and I kind of say that in terms of knowing some of the details in politics and in our own culture so well that we can spit them out to racists who might try to say, hey, you haven't contributed anything to society. And not that we really need to engage that kind of debate, but I think it is empowering, and it is a need for us to really to really I would say soak ourselves or baptize ourselves in as much black history as possible. But to your point, even if the average African American doesn't read Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk, I think the experience itself, the collective memory, our social memory, and our everyday experiences teaches us and reminds us when we want to forget that racism is just haunting and taunting us. Wayman said he sound privileged. I was going to ask how privileged is this guy. He sound privileged. Good point. So I kind of want to share that. I thank you all for chiming in. I'm not saying blacks can't have this kind of discussion. Much of what you read is what I see. Oh, hold on. Could participate. The education system doesn't provide information such that people can learn. Absolutely, that's true. G.D. Stokes said, I've taken, what are you saying? Is that 9 or 6 African history classes in college, and it all sounds the same. Our education system doesn't teach basic education. That's true. Yeah, it's true. Yeah, that's something we'll talk about more. But anyway, I hope some of this was invigorating or stimulating. Even if you didn't agree with anything I said, hopefully some things I said were important enough for you to hear, to motivate you to to keep growing and in our studies and understanding of our society, and also to engage others, and also to see that there are people, our brothers and sisters don't share the same views as we do, and we have a lot of work and we have a lot of discussions to be had. Anyway, I got to shut down now. I hope all of you can tune in tomorrow. I have an amazing playwright actress. Her name is Nan Lynn Nelson, and so she's going to be on, and she has a play coming up called Glory in New York City. And if you want to win a ticket, tune in tomorrow, all right? And I'll give you the details on how to get that ticket. Thanks again, Political Soul Food. G.D. Stokes, thanks a lot, bro. Thanks for tuning in. Y'all can check me out on Patreon or on PayPal to support this. Most importantly, make sure you try to do what you got to do. 8:30 is the time. All right, so I got to sign out on IG because we got like 30 seconds. I can continue on the other platforms a little bit longer. So IG, peace and love. Y'all take it easy. All right, so hopefully tomorrow. No, that's not the sister I played music for. This is someone else. This is someone else. I actually put up a story. Oh, I put up a post too on the Facebook page, so you could check her out there. Good people we met through a mutual friend, and so it should be nice. It should be a cool interview. I got to prep for that tomorrow, 8:30. So I hope you can be there, Wayman. It's good to see you here, man. You always bring that great energy and that wisdom with you. Thanks for chiming in to Political Soul Food. I'm gonna see y'all tomorrow. Peace out.